Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead with some of the introductory here. This is our April Artificial Intelligence for Clinicians, AI4C lecture series. And today we are fortunate to have Dr. Harry Trivedi from Emory University. Going to talk about lessons learned from AI model deployment, the need to be vigilant. As you know, this is a monthly lecture series that happens the second Thursday of the month from September to May. We've had a really great lineup. As I said today, we have Dr. Trivedi, and we have next month Dr. Tessa Cook from the University of Pennsylvania. But note that that is not the second Thursday; it's the first Thursday. So we're doing unfortunately for May a different week. So hopefully you can join that, and you'll see the announcements come out to register for that. As always, you can view our past recordings at the link there, and Carrie Ann will put the link into the chat if you're interested in looking at any of the past recordings that have been done over the years and this past year. And we ask that you please fill out the survey. Also, the link is in the chat. And you can follow us, MGBAI, on a number of social media constructs, including LinkedIn, Twitter, and so on. And there's our website, and you can see some of the other educational activities, as well as descriptions about this series. So today, we have Dr. Harry Trivedi. He received his Bachelor's of Science from the Georgia Institute of Technology and an MD from the Medical College of Georgia. He completed a fellowship in musculoskeletal imaging at the University of California, San Francisco, and he is currently an associate professor in the Division of Emergency and Trauma Imaging in the Department of Radiology and Imaging Sciences at Emory University. And he also has appointments in the Department of Biomedical Informatics and Emergency Medicine. He's also a member of the Cancer Prevention and Control Research Program, the Winship Cancer Institute for Emory University. Dr. Trivedi co-hosts the Health Innovation and Translational Informatics, the HITI Lab, leading efforts that really develop and implement AI solutions in healthcare. He's going to share some of that with us today. His work focuses on large-scale dataset curation, clinical translation of AI models, including validation of commercial models, and novel techniques for post-deployment monitoring, a very important aspect that I believe he's going to share with us. And he's supervised more than 30 undergraduates, graduate, and doctoral students. He also chairs a number of committees. He chairs the Radiology AI Council at Emory, overseeing AI model evaluation, deployment, and monitoring. And nationally, he's served as the chair of the Radiological Society of North America, the RSNA Radiology AI Data Standards, the RAIDS Committee. And he works with companies to advance healthcare in AI technology. So today he's going to share some of the lessons from all of that background, lessons learned from AI model deployment, and the need to remain vigilant. So Dr. Trivedi, please, I'm going to stop share and you can go ahead and share.
All right. Thank you for that. I'm smiling because I think that's the longest introduction I've ever received. But thank you, Kathy and the AI4C team for having me. As Kathy mentioned, we are going to talk a little bit about the lessons we've learned at Emory from AI model deployment, a council that we frame, a framework that we created through a radiology AI council and what is increasingly becoming more evidence-based with this need to continue to remain vigilant and aware of the strengths and weaknesses of AI so that we can harness it appropriately for patient care. So I'll go about a little bit of background. We'll dive right into the problem statement and where all this began. Talk about the formation of the Radiology AI Council at Emory, which occurred last year. We developed a framework for AI model evaluation, which is currently under review, but will be public so that others can use it at their institution. We'll go over some of our initial results from the council, our findings, our recommendations. And then the second half, or maybe the latter third of the presentation, we'll talk about our work in post-deployment monitoring and subgroup evaluation, and at least where I think that the field is headed, and how this may impact regulatory guidance for models that are cleared. So this began in April 2023. We deployed a few commercial models for PE, pulmonary embolism detection, ICH detection, and incidental pulmonary embolism detection. And the way that those models sort of landed on our doorstep is, I think, the way that a lot of healthcare software adoption or any software adoption works is that somebody meets somebody at a conference, or somebody from a sales team reaches out, finds sort of an internal champion, they start talking and have a couple of promising conversations about what can be done and use of the model and its ROI. And then that model sort of makes its way through the chain of command and budgeting, et cetera. And then 2, 3 years later in healthcare, maybe 2 years later, gets deployed. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what was sorely lacking for us, which I'll get into, is a lack of a data-driven approach in selecting which models we're going to deploy. I think as a field, we have moved well beyond bench performance of models and how well their metrics are. And most vendors don't even really tout that at their booths at conferences anymore. And it's really focused on deployment and integration. And so it becomes like even more important, I think, to be very um, prescriptive about which models you're selecting. So we deployed these models in April 2023. A lot of folks were excited, a lot of folks were skeptical. And about 4 or 5 months later, I started getting a flurry of emails about, hey, this pulmonary embolism was missed, or this ICH was missed, or hey, I'm getting a lot of false positives. And they had been sort of peppered throughout over the several months, and we were collecting feedback through the app from the vendor. But there was this uptick right around August, and it was enough to raise our attention. And me and the informatics team started discussing internally, and it became very apparent that we didn't have a framework in place for how to handle this situation. That kind of hadn't really been considered about, once we get this thing deployed, what's going to happen when things go wrong. And so this emails started circulating, who's in charge of this after it's deployed. We all know who is in charge of getting the integration done. That's IT. Who's responsible for quality, who's responsible for various components. But after it was all deployed, we didn't really have a chain of command. And then there wasn't also a established feedback mechanism or direct channel to the vendor. And then questions really started coming up as, well, if this model, if we suspect that it's incorrect so much, should we stop using it, or should we pause it until we have more information? And so this entire process was actually the organic beginning of us creating this radiology AI council inside of Emory. And when we approached the vendor and said, here's our suspicion, we suspect the model's underperforming, what can you provide us? Essentially, this is the type of chart we got. This is just a schematic, but you get an X bar chart, which they have a baseline prevalence that they expect based on other institutions and your institution. And if they have 5 points above or below one standard deviation of that expected prevalence, then it's flagged as an outlier and they'll do a deeper dive. And so they showed us our chart. We had four continuous points under, and I think this is at weekly intervals. So 4 points under the baseline, and then the next point was above. So, it didn't flag. The point is that this is, in my opinion, a pretty weak way. It's better than nothing, but it's a pretty weak way to evaluate if a model is performing well or not. Because number one, it's not a direct measure of the model's performance against ground truth. And second, it does not account at all for any changes in prevalence that may occur over time. Now, one could argue that for intracranial hemorrhage and PE, you don't expect drastic changes in prevalence over time. But what if it was a pneumonia detection model, right? And you're in your baseline year and you expect more pneumonias in the winter than you do in the summer, but you don't have baseline data to compare against. So it really highlighted the need for us to take a step back and think about how we were going to attempt to monitor these models. And I think there's a big vacuum in this space. So it brought us to this question of governance. What does governance look like for radiology AI? And so I started looking about, well, what is a governor? Where does that word even come from? And it's from the days of the steam engine. And if you put too much fire in the boiler and too much steam was generated, the engine would blow up. The pistons start moving too fast and the engine would basically explode. And so this concept of a governor was created, that you have these two weighted balls hanging on two arms. And as the shaft spins faster and faster, the centrifugal force pushes those balls out. And as those balls get pushed out, it closes the air intake valve and slows down the air coming into the engine and slows down the combustion, right? And then as the amount of steam, decreases, those the shaft will spin more slowly and the balls will come down. And so it's sort of this like self-regulation. And so it really got me interested in thinking, okay, well, how do we apply this concept of self-governance so that we don't have AI models, going out of control and blowing up our healthcare engine. Um, and in the process of doing this exploration, we realized a couple things. One is we need governance. Second is that the reliance on vendor reported metrics cannot be our only source of information. And that the third is the technology for monitoring exists, especially now in the days of LLMs. It's not a technology issue, it's a pipeline issue, getting the right data in the right place and then in front of the right people to do this sort of monitoring. And unfortunately, right now, since post-deployment monitoring is not yet mandated by regulatory bodies and also not yet highly demanded by end users, we're in this state where post-deployment monitoring might be a mild differentiator for certain AI companies, but largely, in my opinion, it serves as a cost center. And until there's sort of this either demand from the end user that we're not going to buy this model until we have this in place, or uh, guidance from the FDA saying this has to be a component of AI cleared models, we're not going to get there. So we took a step back, started thinking about, okay, well, what are the components of governance? These ideas are not novel, right? What we did is look at existing literature and existing frameworks and thought of how to governance and picked the ones that were relevant to us and specifically to radiology AI, knowing the shortfalls that we do experience. So the first one was transparency, the whole black box issue. It's been, discussed ad nauseum. But we decided, if we're gonna pick a model, we should know when and how it was developed, what data it was trained on, how it's going to be deployed. And an extension of that is that we should know that the data it was trained on is demographically diverse from various geographic sites, from various scanner manufacturers. And I think for those of us that are in this space, we take this piece of information for granted, right? It's been known for several years now that data diversity matters, demographic diversity, scanner diversity all matters. But if you rewind 3 or 4 or 5 years at the time that some of these models were cleared, this actually was not state of the art, or it could not be considered a de facto methodology at that point, right? So we do still need to look back. Some of these models might have been cleared in 2020, 2021. There's no expiration date, at least to my knowledge. And so we still need to make sure that the models that we're using are trained on, diverse enough data sets. Um, One of the studies we did a few years ago did demonstrate that, and I know Judy Gachoya was a speaker in this panel, and I'm sure she talked about this, but we showed that AI models can recognize the race of a patient based on a single medical image, whether it be a chest X-ray, a head CT, a knee X-ray, abdominal CT slice, brain MR, mammogram. So we know that this data is baked into the image, and we know therefore that the model could use shortcuts to arrive at a conclusion based on that image if it's guessing the patient's demographics or age or something else, right? So understanding how the model is trained is, I think, paramount to ensuring that it's deployed safely. Security and privacy, I think nothing new here, but obviously most models are deployed in the cloud now. So you have some on-prem VM that's taking DICOM images, de-identifying them, routing them to a cloud server. So risk is reduced, but it's non-zero. So we just want to understand what that process looks like. Um, Accountability is on both sides. So what we mean by this is accountability from the vendor to be able to explain these things and be held accountable if the model is not performing as expected, but also accountability for model results, which I'll get into a little bit. Namely, if the model is providing alerts to multiple radiologists, who is responsible for those alerts, right? And then if an AI, which this is in my mind not a question of if, but when, if an AI becomes completely autonomous, and there is a model that was uh, cleared, CE cleared in Europe for chest X-ray in 2022, so it's been a few years, fully autonomous. reads for negative exams. This will happen here in the US, I think, inevitably, right? And so, who is liable for the AI model's decision at that point if a radiology is not reviewing the image? I think that what will happen if we don't proactively answer this question is that essentially lawyers will answer it for us, right? And the liability will go to the hospital system and also the company. I've been in a few conversations where it was suggested that the company must carry X million dollars of liability insurance in the event that this happens. But as many of you know, if you know audience members in healthcare, when somebody gets named, when there's a bad patient outcome, every provider, nurse, and you know anybody in the room that was present, and any radiology that a radiologist that touched any image for that patient during the entire stay gets named in the lawsuit. So I think we really, as a field, should think about what this is going to look like if truly autonomous AI is deployed. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about post-deployment monitoring, what the resources are needed by companies to do this and resources needed inside the institution. So we set up the council, as I mentioned. We have 16 representatives, one from every radiology subspecialty, one from medical physics. We have representatives from revenue cycle management and um, business development. And then if radiology models are going to impact other departments, meaning cardiology, for example, is a common one, emergency department is another common one, we bring representatives in from those departments as well to participate in the conversation. A lot of the things we do now in radiology that are gaining traction in radiology AI, I should say, are in the field of opportunistic screening. And almost, I won't say almost always, but in many cases, if not most cases, the beneficiary of that opportunistic screening model is obviously one, the patient, but the results really land on the desk of somebody outside of the radiology department. And so it's important to include them in the conversation. Um, and so we just want to make sure that we take the lessons we learned from our initial deployment and incorporate them. We took about 6 months sitting, trying to figure out how we would put a framework around this. And what we ended up with is an evaluation framework with around 60 questions and 13 sections, which I'll go through. This has been submitted for peer review, and it will actually be released. So this is a real live Microsoft Office form. I think we have the ability to make it public, so we'll go through all this stuff. But our hope is that people can download this, use it for their own institution, and obviously modify it as well for whatever needs they have. And so we'll just go through quickly. Some of these are pretty obvious, and some of these I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive, but we'll go through the 13 sections. So general information. The concept of a champion, I think, is important, and this is something I wasn't aware of until I really started working more closely with AI companies when it comes time to integration. You need somebody on the inside at the institution that's willing to send the weekly nudge emails and quarterback, getting IT on board for integrating things. So internal champion in radiology and external champion in another department. And then another thing we came across is like external references. The field is small, the world of radiology is small. And anytime we are considering a vendor, one of the main questions we ask them is, hey, do you have anybody else, preferably another academic center that's using this? And can we, are you willing to introduce us to them to have a candid conversation? And most of the time the answer is yes. Sometimes they get a bit cagey, but we press on it because I think it's important to hear it from the horse's mouth, right? Um, the next section is basic use case assessment. What is it being used for? Is it inpatient, outpatient? What subspecialties? What modalities? Performance evaluation is current evidence that's been made available for the model. That could be from the vendor's website. That could be peer-reviewed evidence that includes what data the model was validated on, the FDA regulatory paperwork itself. It's published, and you can read it, and you can see what the performance metrics are and how many cases they tested on, etc. When possible, we'll also do an internal validation on our own internal data set, which we're able to extract and curate. Competing solutions, this was really born out of our first go around here, where there might be 5 ICH solutions on the market. We picked one, but I don't think there was a concerted effort to systematically evaluate the other one. So we have added this as its own separate line item and said, okay, well, what else is out there that can do this? And should we at least we try to make a habit of now at least evaluating two or three solutions for a given use case before selecting them. Integration planning, pretty self-explanatory here. Is, do you need a VM? Is the server on-prem, off-prem? Does it need to live at the scanner on the edge? Things like that. Alerts management, which we'll talk about a little bit. Post-deployment monitoring, we've talked about already. Finances, we put a special section in there, and I think, the truth is, in an ideal world, these models quality pays for itself, right? In an ideal situation, better patient outcomes, better less likelihood of medical legal issues. But I think the truth is, in a fee-for-service system like we have in the US, quality improvement in quality doesn't always necessarily map to improvement in financial outcomes. And so we consider this its own evaluation, and this should not be try to make it so that this is not the make or break decision factor for choosing a model, but it does get worked in is how much are we going to pay for this model? Do we expect to at least break even based on XYZ factors, whether it's efficiency or referrals, things like that? Patient impact assessment. So um, can we throughput more patients than we otherwise could? Are there other value add things that would positively affect our patients? um, Cross-departmental effects I talked about. So things that are going and flowing to other departments. For example, a lot of stroke alert tools, they flow straight to the ED docs or the neurointerventional team before the radiologist even sees it. So we want to make sure that we consider that. Legal and compliance. So, this concept of decreased medical legal risk by models that improve diagnostic accuracy, that's kind of a net positive, right? But the question that hasn't been answered, at least I haven't been able to find an answer to, is are the results from AI models discoverable um, if there's a missed finding? And what happens if a radiologist happens to disagree with the AI model? Um, can that prediction from the AI model be held against them? And I'm not aware of any cases like that. But if this type of stuff is saved in the medical record, I think that a lawyer could look at it and use it as part, maybe not the only piece of evidence, but use it as part of the evidence that the physician performed, under the standard of care, something like that, right? So that's part of it. Data sharing, how much of our data is flowing back to the vendors? Are they going to be able to retrain their models using cases that we flag as false negatives or false positives? And in fact, it's funny because that's I would say one of the most common questions or pushback I got from some of our radiologists. The app we use has a button that you can mark if the AI prediction was correct or incorrect. And a lot of the rads in the first few weeks emailed me and said, I'm not clicking that button. I'm not working for free for the AI companies. And it was a good point. Why are we providing them feedback? That's our work and our effort. And so it just, it at least should encourage us to ask the question of, when we mark these results as true positives or false positives or whatnot, how does that data use? Now, in our case, it was just used as aggregate performance data, and the vendor doesn't have rights to the DICOM images to retrain. But it's a question worth at least knowing the answer to. Um, and then overall impact analysis, this is sort of our last section where we look at the global effects, so financial effect, patient benefit, in the short term and in the long term, and then the final decision framework and scores, which I'll talk about, and then we make a final recommendation. So I want to do, we can't go through all 13 sections here, but I want to just deep dive a little bit on a couple of things here. So um, with integration, I think our institution and a lot of other institutions have realized that one of the biggest burdens is the integration. And it's not that it's difficult to integrate, it's that IT is busy, hospital IT is busy. At our institution, we don't have our own separate quote unquote radiology IT team. They're all part of the hospital IT. So requests get triaged and put on a plan of when this is going to be deployed. And so the easier you make it, the better. And what that means is that if you have a platform that handles multiple models, probably have a better chance of switching on a new model in that platform than integrating to a completely new platform. Um, there are also some PACS vendors that are making pretty concerted efforts now to build in AI workflows directly into PACS, like tightly integrated. And so they would ingest a model that's Dockerized into PACS and deliver those results in. And that what that means is you get really tight integrations. And instead of getting secondary captures or screenshots or PDFs, you could actually get a DICOM object that displays directly on the image. And in conversations with companies in this space, what we realize is that even though the standards exist for DICOM secondary captors and DICOM SR and DICOM objects for annotations, that vendors tend to deploy at the lowest common denominator that gives them the maximum compatibility. So rather than, you know, allocating resources towards doing that really tight integration with GE and then doing it with Sectra and then doing it with Fuji and doing it with Siemens, they'll just say, well, we can make one secondary cap and push it back to uh, the archive, and our problems are solved, right? And so, at least for us, vendors going that extra mile and looking at the integrated platforms, we use Sectra Pack. Sectra has a new product called Amplifier, and so we're looking at models that exist on Amplifier because it would give us a tighter integration. And in some situations, no matter how much we talk to companies and try to understand what this is going to be like, I think everybody feels a little bit too uncomfortable going to deployment. And so we do shadow deployments, let it run in the background, collect data before doing a full rollout. Um, Alerts management was a huge pain point for us, so I'll spend a little bit of time here. So the model we had deployed was a triaging model, or I should say is a triaging model for ICH PE and incidental PE. And the way it works is a little applet runs on the desktop, and anytime a study hits the work list that is positive for a certain finding, it throws out an alert to every radiologist who has their filters set a certain way. So the applet allows you to filter by, what site you're at or what hospital system you're at, whether you're working with inpatients, outpatients, or ED patients, and what algorithm you would like to receive alerts for. So first challenge is just like residents, faculty have rotations. One day you're on outpatient for this hospital, the next day you're on inpatient procedures, the next day you're somewhere else, right? So faculty are having to switch their filters for their alerts to make sure they get alerts for the relevance exams. So that's number one. Number two is that if you have five faculty reading off one list, let's say outpatient across the enterprise, all five of them have that alert switched on correctly, let's say. Now, a positive case comes through, five radiologists get the alert, and then none of them take responsibility. And it's this diffusion of responsibility issue that actually came up multiple times, and it was almost the rule rather than the exception. Is I think people just got alert fatigue, started ignoring the alerts even for these positive cases, and we had to scramble to create alternative workflows or assign somebody to be in charge of alerts at that time of day. And it's still not a perfect system, but this was a big kind of wake up call for us because it caused a lot of downstream problems. And, if the whole point of having this AI model deployed is to catch positive cases earlier, make sure we don't miss them, and then you're missing the alert, kind of lost the entire plot. So we have some workflow specialists that kind of help us out in this situation, but it's still imperfect, right? So this is a big component of our rubric. For those of you that take a look at it, you'll see it there, and then continuous monitoring, which we'll talk about as well. And then impact assessment. So we touched on this a little bit, but just to flesh it out a little bit. So financial impact can be a few ways, and I think most of this stuff follows common sense, but we wanted to evaluate each one independently. So one is direct reimbursement. Is there an NTAP or a CPT code for this? Efficiency gains, a little bit harder to quantify, but if it saves a rad, you know, 30 minutes a day across 50 studies, or let's say a minute a study over 50 studies, and you have five rads and you know what their salary is, et cetera, you can calculate sort of a cost savings. And in a time where all radiology departments across the nation are kind of drowning, that efficiency gain can be a huge advantage to workflow, but also to recruitment, retention, those sorts of things, right? The third is referral generation. So you can attach an ROI if you are generating a referral, let's say for opportunistic screening case, and they're getting referred to cardiology, and some percentage of those patients end up having an intervention or a stent, you can make an ROI on that, right? So we use all of that information to try and estimate. A lot of vendors are getting good at doing this too, at looking at projections, because they're realizing that, at least, there's usually two sets of conversations. One is with the rads and the model performance, and if they like the workflow, and the other is with the business folks of, how is this going to affect our bottom line? We talked about patient impact already, so I'll skip that. And then cross-departmental effects. So again, back to the workflow example, back to the opportunistic screening example, we're looking at a couple models for incidental coronary artery calcification and aortic valve calcification on non-contrast, non-gated chest CTs, right? So truly catching findings that are there on the image, but sort of variably mentioned or discussed and usually never quantified. And so the referrals for those go to cardiology, but you have to do a lot to filter out cases, for example, for patients that are already being seen by cardiology. You don't want to send a notification for that. You want to filter out patients that have diagnostic codes or procedural codes for existing stents. You probably want to filter out patients over a certain age, which, that wouldn't be otherwise intervened on, or let's say oncology patients who this may not be a good time for them to go see cardiology, or they're already being followed by cardiology, right? So there's a lot of post hoc evaluation to be done with the results for a model before you distill this very broad screening tool into actionable and tangible results. And then the last is legal and compliance, which we talked about a little bit already. So so let's see, this is April. So between April and now, we have evaluated 13 models through the council, three of which were already deployed, kind of down here in pink. These are just their aggregate characteristics, sort of in the first two sections of the rubric, what patient classes are affected. So all of them affect outpatients. Some of them affect inpatients, but not all, and most, all but two affect ED patients. Um, the three that we had deployed were for triaging, but we also categorize them into, and some of these overlap. They can be a little bit of a false classification in terms of trying to shove a model into a certain category. But as best we could do, a few of these are triaging models, a few would then be considered as detection, and a few of them would be considered as diagnostic. And then there's risk prediction, right? So in the cancer space or in the opportunistic screening space, you are detecting or diagnosing coronary artery calcifications, but really what you're trying to use it for is to predict the risk of a patient and have a downstream effect. And this will all be in our paper, but I will just go through some of these results. So the ones here in pinkish are the models we deferred. So there was a couple models from one vendor for chest X-ray and head CT that did multiple diagnoses. And although the metrics for this model were favorable, meaning, we expected mild increased efficiency. This is per radiologist per day. So, 15 minutes per day per rad, decreased turnaround time for ED patients and outpatients, and potential financial ROIs because of reimbursement codes. It was felt that the model performance, the performance metrics were not quite up to snuff, and that we would end up overwhelming radiologists with a bunch of notifications and flags for false positive results. And so we've gone back to that vendor and sort of talked to them about maybe tailoring down the offering and changing the operating point, for example, so that we can really focus on, the definite positive cases. A few others, for example, here in yellow, we've recommended shadow deployment so we can collect data on the background. The ones in green, we've actually recommended for deployment. That doesn't mean we've deployed them. It means that we've sort of now started the process of finding the budget, putting it in the workflow for IT, et cetera. And so we are working on a couple of opportunistic screening models, a breast cancer risk model we recommended for deployment, and then a volume and segmentation model for degenerative brain disease. And then the models that we evaluated that we have currently for these three use cases, after going through sort of systematically and looking at our performance, which I'll show next, we have actually recommended to discontinue those models. So that would be, and we're hoping, we still think that these are good use cases, but we're hoping we can switch into something, a model or a workflow that benefits us a little bit more. Um, so again, models that were recommended for full deployment, they either improved accuracy, reduced workflow, they were highly compatible work with existing workflows or had financial benefit. Shadow deployment still had some uncertainty around them around integration. Models we deferred where either the performance wasn't there or it would be too expensive or we just don't need them right now. And then the discontinued models were, poor performance or unfavorable cost benefit analysis. Okay, so I want to talk about post-deployment monitoring here. This is the second half. I think we're still done good on time. And there's a lot to unpack here. So I'm just going to give you guys a few examples and then make sure we have time for questions. So models, the summary here is models don't perform the way you expect them to once they're deployed in clinical settings. And it's because of the way that the FDA does clearance right now, or at least did several years ago, which is collect a couple hundred cases and binarize the ground truth. And that leaves too much room for error and too many potential unseen gaps in model performance. And so this is just an example. This is the model that we had deployed at Emory. This is their FDA clearance. It was 198 cases. It was not it was not described if these were outpatients, inpatients, or ED patients, and I'll talk about why that's important. And their overall sensitivity was reported at 94%. So this is kind of what they're cleared and approved for, right? Um, so what we set out to do is take 50,000 cases that were evaluated by the AI model over the past year and try and suss out the performance, the real world performance of that model on our data. So we developed an entire 50 or so class labeling system that for non-contrast head CTs will label the presence of a hemorrhage, its acuity, location, size, whether there's mass effect and whether there's midline shift. And we set to work training or training and testing LLMs. So this figure is a little bit out of date, but this just shows an example. So we're extracting from the reports if a hemorrhage was positive or negative. If it's positive, was it extraaxial, subarachnoid, intraparenchymal, intraventricular? And we have this for all of these classes described on the left. And as you can see here, GPT-4o in most cases did the best. 4 mini was not far behind. Llama 3B did pretty well after a lot of prompt engineering. I won't go into too many details here. I would say the take-home messages across these classes, we have around 95% sensitivity and 95% accuracy is what we could take it as, right? And so now you can actually do a subgroup evaluation, right? So if you recall, the overall FDA clearance metric for this model for intracranial hemorrhage was 94% or 93 or 94%. What we show here is that our overall sensitivity was 85%. What we also show is that in the outpatient class, which is the class that you probably want the highest sensitivity, right? Because those patients may sit on the list for a day or two or a half day. The sensitivity is almost 20 points lower than the FDA metrics. We did not see any difference in performance across racial groups, age groups, or gender. But we did see here performance differences across acuity. So the acute hemorrhages had very high performance. That's probably what the model was trained on and cleared on. But for chronic, you're down in the 70s, subacute, you're down in the 70s. And then for extraaxial hemorrhages, you're in the mid 80s, right? And so if we think about, for the radiologists in the audience, if you think about what are you most likely to miss as a radiologist, it's probably the small subdurals and small subarachnoids, right? And the performance, if the performance of those is lower, I don't need a AI model to tell me the performance of an intraparenchymal, or I don't need a AI model to flag a 4 centimeter intraparenchymal hemorrhage. And so when you have 50 different classes and every possible permutation of them, we started exploring ways that we can actually visualize this. And so I'm going to try to switch over here. So this is a sunburst plot of performance of the model. So the color here, the bar on the right indicates sensitivity. So dark blue is the worst. Light blue and whitish is in the 70s. And as you get closer to red, it's it's a higher performance. And so right away we see here, so this is for outpatients. We see here that the sensitivity for outpatients with a single hemorrhage is only 70%, right? The performance for patients with multiple hemorrhages is 90%, right? It stands to reason that as your hemorrhage burden goes up, the model performance increases. But if we think as radiologists, what do we need help with? If a patient has a multi-compartment hemorrhage, I'm not likely to miss it. So if I dive into single compartment hemorrhage here and show, extraaxial 73% along the convexity back to 70%. And then by size, the less than 5 millimeters where we need the most help, the sensitivity is close to half, right? And you can look at various combinations here. So if you have an extraaxial collection along the convexity, but that's also along the falx, um, or the falx and tentorium, the performance goes up, right? For all multi-compartmental hemorrhages, the performance is overall quite good, with the exception of, as you would expect, extraaxial and subarachnoid. And so this really, I mean, we this data just we started looking at it about a week ago, and we're still figuring out how to parse this, how to present it, um, and what to make of it. There are mistakes. The LLM is not perfect in extracting the ground truth, but to be clear, this is comparing the ground truth extracted by the LLM against the AI model's prediction, right? And so, although there are margins of errors here, I think, showing that the performance for single versus multi-compartmental hemorrhage is this different, I think is quite important. And we did the same thing for breast cancer, right? So for breast cancer, we have not deployed a breast cancer model, but this is retrospective work that we did that again highlights the same concept. We created a breast imaging data set called Embed. It's about 110,000 patients. And the unique thing about this data set is that we have a lot of granular information about their imaging findings, about their cancer outcomes, their demographics, et cetera. And this was a performance evaluation of a commercial FDA cleared cancer detection model for digital breast tomosynthesis or DBT, right? And what we see is that overall their FDA clearance metrics, AUC of 0.93, we show overall performance of 0.91 on our data, right? Now, the problem is that the sensitivity for invasive cancers is 83%, and the sensitivity for non-invasive cancers is only 55%, right? The reason for that is that the model is very insensitive to calcifications. So calcifications are arguably the hardest thing to detect on mammograms, and they are highly correlated with non-invasive cancers. So if a radiologist or a department is considering this model and looks at its overall performance metric in AUC of 0.93 and an overall recall of 0.86, they're feeling pretty good about it. They say, okay, I'm going to catch most cancers. And I think the risk here is that you lower your guard or lower your sensitivity, right? You're not looking as hard if the model flags it as negative, you feel good about it. It's an AI automation bias. But without data like this, you actually don't know what you are potentially missing as a radiologist, right? So the model developers don't know. No subgroup evaluation of this type has been done on any breast cancer model, or any cancer detection model to my knowledge. So the vendors don't know about it, and the radiologists don't know about it. And so, if we look at sort of by grouping here, you can see like screen detected cancer sensitivity, 73%, can look by class, what the false positive and false negative rate is for screen negative, diagnostic negative, benign biopsy lesions. Can also look at the performance by finding. So we see here, for example, that architectural distortions have a much higher rate of false positives. So we see that architectural distortions that are completely negative on screening still are 39% false positives. And the spread, the x-axis here is the score. So the higher the score, the more suspicious the model was. This type of data will enable radiologists to be more informed when they use the model so that, again, they don't misinterpret positive or negative model results and still sort of remain vigilant. And same thing here, sunburst plot. If we look at it, we can see, for example, all screen detected cancers, the median score of the model is 62. So this model has an operating point of 0.1 down here. So everything green is below the operating point. So for invasive cancers, the median score is quite good. For non-invasive cancers, the median score is still above the threshold, it's still 0.17. But you start looking at the performance for these various subgroups. So if there's a calcification only And certain types, linear calcifications are detected well, but clustered calcifications are not, or segmental calcifications are predicted with high scores. And so we can start looking at the performance of the model across these various subgroups. Um, FDA is working on this. There's a new guideline that was released in 2024 for predetermined change control plan that will hopefully provide more guidance on how models will be updated and regulated in the future. I don't think that we can rely on static models forever going forward and do a whole new regulatory submission every time a new model the model weights are updated, for example. So we'll be paying, I think, close attention to the guidance that comes out. And I hope to see additional guidance on doing subgroup evaluation so that we can actually better understand how models are performing. So in conclusion, governance of radiology AI models, I think, is a lot more complex than it appears on the surface. And financial ROI cannot be ignored in our US fee-for-service system. Um, think the other take home here is don't believe everything you read. Don't take metrics and FDA clearance, even FDA clearance metrics at face value. And then last is we've been just thinking a lot about diseases and diseases, whether they be cancer or PE or ICH or not binary. You know, a large intraparenchymal hemorrhage is not the same as a 5 millimeter subdural, and an invasive cancer is not the same as a non-invasive cancer, and a subsegmental PE is not the same as a lobar or saddle PE. And so as we continue to dive into understanding model performance and how it will affect us as radiologists, we should really start thinking about diseases in terms of their various components and subgroups that have various impacts on patients. And that's all I have. Thanks very much.
Wow, fantastic. Let's see, have I unmuted? Okay. Fantastic, Dr. Trivedi. Wonderful discussion and wonderful framework for the implementation piece. You know, there's been so much focus on the models themselves, the performance, which is really a model performance. It's not a clinical performance.
Hmm.
Clinical slash
Right.
financial slash return on investment, all of those kind
Yeah.
of validation. And I think it's wonderful to have this framework that you described, really starting at the top with um, who's in charge,
Yeah.
who can help with the activity in terms of a clinical champion, and so on. I was struck by, a couple of things. Yeah, I guess, the FDA has certainly evolved.
Hmm.
And how they are treating um, the validation or the approval of these models and so on, but still has a way to go. And the predetermined change control plan is a step in the right direction. But I was struck by, does every site need to go through what you just went through when they implement a model? And every site's going to be a little bit different. Does every site need to, create shadow mode, validate for internal use, evaluate subgroups, and so on and so forth? And what if people are implementing these tools and they're at a site that doesn't have the resources that you and your lab have? How do they go about
Yeah. I think that's a great question. Thank you. There are efforts, as I know you're aware, of both companies and organizations working on centralized monitoring of model performance across multiple sites. And I think that that is really promising. So option one is a vendor comes in, says, we have a platform. All you have to do is DICOM send us 500 cases and the reports. And I think most sites adopting AI can probably pull that off because it's just a routing thing, right? We're going to set up an AE title. We're going to send the site the reports and the images, and then that vendor will do everything. They'll determine, okay, for hemorrhage models, this is the ground truth that we want to extract. They'll have their own tuned LLM, and they'll report back to the institution. And then also for post-deployment monitoring, you could do the same thing. There's central collection of sites by a couple organizations that will then take and compare to model performance. So the hope is, yeah, everybody doesn't have to jump through these hoops because it's it's certainly scientifically interesting, but it's not productive from a real world deployment. This is just stuff that gets in our way and having to do all this to prove that there are gaps. I think it's a necessary piece of evidence, but we don't need to keep proving it again and again. I think the next step is to centralize this. Um, we're working on fine-tuning an LLM that hopefully we could release. It took us 6 months to just get. I was actually pretty surprised. I thought, you plug in a radiology report into GPT-4 and it's a chip shot to get out the ground truth. And all you got to do is pay for the tokens. And out of the box, the performance is really bad. I mean, it's 85%, which is just not good enough. Um, so I was pretty surprised at even just abstracting information from radiology reports is still not a solved problem. And I think as soon as somebody's willing to tackle that at scale, it's definitely tractable. I think the technology exists.
Yeah, no, that was going to be one of my other questions, and I've seen one that's come up here about the use of LLMs, and evaluating those are a little bit more work, in fact,
Mm.
than some of the traditional models that where we do have metrics of the model and sort of outcomes. The LLMs may be a little more subjective and how the result is, but we have a couple of questions here. One is,
Yeah.
we've seen compare. I think they mean comparison of LLM model versus model results. How about comparing the AI output with actual radiologists' findings? So I think people have done that, but
Yeah.
are you doing that as well?
So in order to evaluate the AI model in order to evaluate the LLM's performance in abstracting the ground truth from the reports, we manually annotated 1,000 cases. So we had 3 residents and 3 faculty go through and annotate 1,000 cases for the presence of all of those findings. And we've done it for ICH and PE. So we can take the AI model's performance and compare it against those 1,000 ground truth cases. We observe similar trends, but with less power, meaning by the time you dive into a 5 millimeter subdural combined with a subarachnoid in the sylvian fissure, you're at like an N of one, right? So um, we saw similar trends. I think that there is still possible error in the LLM extraction, and then obviously the next step in this would be to re-review a certain amount of cases, eyes on image, right? Have a radiologist re-review the cases and and compare it to the AI output. Now, one thing I didn't mention though is that all of the 50,000 cases we evaluated are cases that were interpreted in conjunction with the AI model, meaning this is the year after the AI model was deployed, and the radiologist at the time of generating that report had the AI model results, which you could interpret in one of two ways. They either, they're biased or they're less likely to miss something. But that is a little nuance there.
Yeah, but I think people are using the LLMs really as a quote unquote annotation tool, or in a way to evaluate how well these do. And I think a practice that we do is a subset. You can't
Hmm.
hundreds of thousands because it's a big lift, very
Right.
expensive activity, very time consuming, but then the shortcut. Let's see. A question here from Susie Goldstein. What mechanism or processes are you seeing to address the potential AI model false negative results?
Hmm.
We don't know that. Are the implications for AI model false negatives being addressed realistically when considering return on investment? It's a great question.
So I'll tackle the first half because I think the second half is, the answer to the second half is I don't know. But I think the answer to the first half is my hope is that if you have this sunburst plot that shows intersection of cases where the model fails, you can go back and train the model by picking cases like that. So the breast cancer one is an easy example because there's not so many permutations. So we know the model underperforms on non-invasive cancers and microcalcifications. I can go now mine more cases of that and update and retune or make a new model that addresses that shortcoming. It's not that the shortcomings are inevitable, but it's that up until now we didn't know that they existed. So I think the first part is addressable by the right now, the way vendors collect data is they go to sites or data brokers and vacuum up cases based on binary ground truth. I want 1,000 breast cancer cases without any attention to the types of cancer, the types of findings, et cetera. And then they parse it out. And what you get then is population prevalence. But if we know the population prevalence of a certain finding is low, that's not an excuse to train on a low prevalence. You have to validate on that prevalence. That doesn't mean you have to train on a low prevalence. So I think that it is addressable, and that's something that we hope to do now that we have this information. We're going to go try and actually see if we can make it less, miss fewer of these cases that had poor performance. With regard to financial ROI, I think that's a tough question, and we only have, 2 minutes, so I'll defer on that.
Fair enough. To be continued, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, should the FDA, I know in the predetermined change control plan is trying to address some of this. I mean, when we evaluate models, pre-FDA approval and or an internally developed, we always fine tune. But
Mhm.
technically, you're not supposed to be able to do that in the FDA approved world. They're set, and
Correct.
you're not supposed to fine tune. Should the FDA really allow that? And is the predetermined change control plan enough? I mean, it's a step
Yeah.
in the right direction. Is there more that it can do? Because maybe there is a benefit to, we're not going to get models that are developed to meet everything. So
Yeah.
we need to allow people.
So maybe the answer to this is the foundation model. I mean, I think the risk of having a model and allowing anybody to fine tune it is you got to monitor the fine tuners. You know, you can really overfit your model and screw it up pretty badly fine tuning it. As a concrete example, when we try to fine tune LLMs with low numbers of cases, the performance gets worse, you know? So I think in theory, it's possible, but in reality, that gives the FDA a whole nother thing to track. So maybe what we need is foundation models that are performant, and then a fine-tuning ability on top of that that can be centrally monitored or maintained. Because if you overfit on your data, you take this model that generalizes and you overfit it on your data, that model will probably experience worse drift over the next 3 years than the general model that you started with, right? So I don't, yeah, I think it's a chicken. I mean, it's a rock and a hard place, you know?
Yes. Okay, Felipe Moras, how to use the performance framework for opportunistic screening solutions that might not be in the radiologist report. And you described a lot of your models there that you were keeping were for opportunistic screening. So, how do you use the framework for opportunistic screening solutions?
Yeah. So if you're referring, Felipe, to the evaluation framework, we kind of use it the same way because a lot of the questions are pertinent to financial benefit for the department, but then also for the institution. And I think the answer there is okay, well, we, the radiology department, perhaps should not be forced to pay for an opportunistic screening model if all the referrals are going or the beneficiary quote. I mean, I hate to, you know, divide up departments like that, but I mean, you kind of have to, right? Departments have their budget, so we wouldn't be the ones paying for it. But if we can present a good use case and say this is good for patient care, it will have a net financial benefit for cardiology and a net patient care benefit for patients. Like opportunistic screening to me is this very nice sweet spot in the US where you actually get a triple win, right? It's better for patients, it's better for payers, and it's better for the bottom dollar. And that's kind of rare in healthcare. Um, but I think the rubric, the way it is now, actually can address that and bubble those to the top.
Great. And we are running out of time, but I love this last question from Khalid Yunus, where you mentioned a lot of the vendors take the easy way out and do DICOM SC or DICOM screen
Mhm.
capture, which is not as good as using DICOM SR as recommended by the IHE. And, I think there are a number of efforts that are ongoing, certainly through the RSNA, to try to get vendors to adhere to some of these better, more functional standards,
Mhm.
but it is difficult to get the vendors. Of course, it costs them. Uh,
Right.
they want to be able to apply it to the most vendors. So we're working on it, Khalid. But thank you for that question. And we
Yeah.
are out of time. I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much, Dr. Trivedi. We really appreciate their wonderful, wonderful talk, and thank you for spending time with us. So
Yep. Thanks so much for having me.
and everyone, 3 weeks, not 4 weeks for the May session. So thanks everyone.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
Harley.
you.
Terrific
Have
talk.
a
Thank you
great
so much.